Picture this. You've spent months crawling through mud, sleeping in trenches, and fighting for your life in the brutal Pacific theater. Your uniform is stiff with dried sweat, your skin burns with infected sores, and lice have made a permanent home in your hair. Then suddenly you're captured by the enemy you've been taught to fear more than death itself. But instead of torture chambers, you're led to something that will shatter everything you believed about your captors. A room filled with gleaming metal pipes and the promise of endless hot water. The first weeks of captivity were a psychological battlefield. As intense as any jungle combat, these hundreds of Japanese prisoners of war had endured. They shuffled through the barbed wire gates of American camps, their bodies bearing the brutal testimony of months spent fighting across the Pacific Islands. Their uniforms, once symbols of imperial pride, now hung like tattered rags, soaked through with layers of sweat, blood, and the accumulated grime of warfare that no amount of rain could wash away. These men had marched through hell itself, across volcanic beaches where the sand burned through boot leather, through dense jungles where humidity turned clothing into second skin, and over coral reefs that sliced feet to ribbons. The tropical heat had been relentless, turning their bodies into furnaces of exhaustion. Dysentery had hollowed out their stomachs, malaria had shaken their bones, and tropical ulcers had eaten craters into their flesh. Yet nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared them for what awaited behind the American wire. After the mechanical processing of registration, the invasive medical examinations, and the distribution of basic supplies that felt more like inventory than human care, they were herded toward a large wooden structure that dominated one corner of the compound. The building itself was unremarkable, standard military construction with corrugated metal roofing, but what lay inside would challenge every assumption these soldiers had about their enemies and themselves. The moment they crossed the threshold, time seemed to freeze. Row upon row of metal nozzles protruded from overhead pipes like mechanical flowers, each positioned above its own drain. The sight was so foreign, so incomprehensible, that many prisoners simply stopped walking, creating a human traffic jam of bewilderment. This wasn't a torture chamber, wasn't a work facility, wasn't anything their military experience had prepared them to recognize. The American guards, efficient in that peculiarly American way that mixed impatience with procedure, began barking orders in harsh English syllables that crashed against Japanese ears like breaking waves. Their gestures, however, needed no translation. Strip, line up, prepare to wash. For the first time since their capture, many prisoners realized this wasn't just about containment. The Americans expected something from them, something that felt dangerously close to care. Among the prisoners, confusion spread like wildfire through dry grass. These men had been soldiers in an army where bathing was a luxury more rare than ammunition. During the brutal island campaigns, water had been strictly rationed, every drop measured, every use calculated for survival rather than comfort. Rivers became temporary lifelines when found, but even then bathing was hurried, communal, and always interrupted by the constant threat of enemy attack. Soap. Soap had been a civilian memory, something their mothers had used in another lifetime before the war consumed everything soft and gentle about existence. Now here, in the hands of their sworn enemies, they were being directed toward what could only be described as an organized ritual of cleansing. The irony was so sharp, it cut deeper than any battlefield wound. Some prisoners clutched their meager belongings, a torn photograph, a dented cup, a lucky charm, as if these pitiful treasures might be confiscated in this strange ceremony. Others whispered nervously in regional dialects, their voices creating a nervous buzz that mixed Osaka street talk with rural mountain accents, urban sophistication blending with agricultural wisdom in their shared bewilderment. The steam rising from the pipes triggered memories of ghost stories told around campfires, of spirits emerging from hot springs in the mountains of home. But these same men remembered other stories, darker tales their officers had whispered before battles, stories of American brutality that would make death in combat seem merciful by comparison. They had been told repeatedly that capture meant humiliation beyond imagination, that prisoners would be treated worse than the lowest animals, that surrender would bring tortures their ancestors couldn't have conceived. Now, staring at this gleaming installation of pipes and drains, They wondered if this was some elaborate American cruelty disguised as kindness. Was this the trap their officers had warned about? Would the water scald their skin? Would chemicals burn their eyes? Would this ritual of washing be their final humiliation before execution? The guards grew increasingly impatient with the hesitation, their voices rising in volume and sharpness. English commands mixed with hand gestures, creating a crude but effective communication. Shoes first, then belts, then the sweat-stained tunics that had become like armor against the world. One by one, with the reluctant movements of men walking to their own execution, scarred bodies emerged from tattered clothing. These weren't the bodies of parade ground soldiers, these were the physical testimonies of a brutal war. Skin mapped with scars from coral cuts, muscles wasted by malnutrition, flesh marked by tropical diseases that had no names in textbooks. The prisoners felt more than naked. They felt exposed in ways that went beyond physical vulnerability. They were being stripped of the last vestiges of military dignity, reduced to their most basic human form in front of strangers who had, until recently, been trying to kill them. Still, military discipline held. When soap bars were thrust into their palms, rough, chemical-scented blocks that felt nothing like the gentle cleansers of home, they gripped them like weapons they didn't understand how to use. Then came the moment that would haunt their dreams and reshape their understanding of everything they thought they knew about America, about war, about human nature itself. The hiss of water from overhead pipes created a sound like a great mechanical serpent awakening. From each nozzle, streams of liquid poured forth, not the cold, rationed drops they had learned to treasure, but cascades of warmth that defied everything they understood about scarcity and survival. The first touch of hot water against skin that had known nothing but cold rivers and occasional rain was such a shock that several prisoners actually jumped backward, bumping into comrades behind them. The sensation was overwhelming, heat that didn't burn, moisture that didn't chill, pressure that massaged rather than punished. For men who had learned to measure water by the spoonful, who had considered a cupful for washing their face a precious luxury, this endless stream represented abundance beyond imagination. The initial terror, that spike of adrenaline that came from expecting pain and finding comfort instead, slowly melted into something more dangerous than fear. Wonder, as the water coursed down their backs and shoulders, washing away layers of grime that had become like additional skin. Some prisoners closed their eyes and for just a moment allowed themselves to forget they were captives. The sensation awakened memories so deeply buried, they thought the war had killed them forever. Memories of childhood baths drawn by loving mothers of hot springs in mountain villages, of a time when being clean was simply part of being human. Others rubbed cautiously with the rough soap, testing whether this apparent kindness was real or illusion. The lather felt strange in their hands, chemical and foreign compared to the gentle soaps of home, but it worked with an efficiency that amazed them. Months of accumulated filth simply dissolved and spiraled down the drains, carrying with it not just dirt, but the psychological weight of degradation they hadn't realized they were carrying. But here's what truly shattered their understanding of the world. This wasn't a special occasion, wasn't a reward for cooperation, wasn't even a one-time humiliation. This was routine, daily, expected. The Americans treated cleanliness not as a luxury to be earned, but as a basic requirement of human existence. Even for prisoners, even for enemies, even for men they had every right to hate. The transformation was subtle at first, then undeniable. Men who had spent months scratching at lice bites found their scalps healing. Soldiers whose feet had been rotting in wet boots discovered that daily washing prevented the tropical rot that had claimed toes and sometimes entire limbs. Bodies that had been constantly fighting infection began to heal in ways that medicine alone couldn't accomplish. The psychological impact was even more profound. These prisoners had been taught that endurance of filth was a mark of honor, that ignoring physical discomfort proved spiritual strength, that accepting hardship without complaint was the essence of being a true warrior. Now they were being forced to confront a different philosophy entirely, one that suggested taking care of the body was not weakness, but wisdom, not indulgence, but necessity. As weeks turned into months, the shower routine became embedded in the rhythm of camp life like a heartbeat that had always been there. The initial fear transformed into anticipation, then into something approaching gratitude, though few would ever admit this aloud. The daily march to the shower hall became a moment of restoration that many prisoners began to crave, a brief respite from the psychological weight of captivity where they could remember what it felt like to be fully human. The Americans, for their part, treated the routine with the same mechanical efficiency they brought to everything else: meal distribution, roll call, work assignments. For them, hygiene was simply a matter of practical camp management, disease prevention, and maintaining order among large groups of men. They couldn't have imagined that something as mundane as soap and hot water was conducting a quiet revolution in the minds of their prisoners, but that revolution was real and profound. These Japanese soldiers, raised in a military culture that glorified suffering and endurance, were discovering that their enemies possessed something their own army had never provided: the systematic care of human dignity, even in defeat. The hot water flowing from American pipes carried with it a message more powerful than any propaganda leaflet: that cleanliness wasn't luxury, but necessity; that health wasn't weakness, but strength; that even prisoners of war deserved to be treated as human beings, rather than discarded tools of warfare. The cultural implications rippled through late-night conversations in the barracks. Men who had marched across Burma whispered about the difference between American abundance and Japanese scarcity. Soldiers who had fought in the Philippines compared the medical care in captivity to what they had received from their own officers. Veterans of Guadalcanal admitted in hushed voices that they were healthier as prisoners than they had ever been as free soldiers in the Imperial Army. These conversations were dangerous, not because the guards would punish such talk, but because they forced these men to confront uncomfortable truths about the society they had been willing to die for. If America could afford to provide hot showers for prisoners, what resources did it reserve for its own soldiers? If American captivity meant better medical care than Japanese service, what did that say about the relative strength of the two civilizations? The soap and water became symbols of something larger, evidence of an industrial capacity so vast that it could extend luxury even to enemies, proof of a social philosophy that valued human welfare above abstract concepts of honor and sacrifice. For men who had been taught that their enemies were barbarians, these daily showers provided uncomfortable evidence of sophistication, organization, and humanity that their own propaganda had never prepared them to recognize. Some prisoners resisted these revelations, clinging to pride and ideology, even as their bodies healed and strengthened under American care. But others began to understand that they were witnessing something historically significant: the collision of two entirely different approaches to human value, military organization, and social responsibility. The transformation extended beyond individual prisoners to reshape the entire social dynamic of the camp. Men who had arrived as broken, defeated soldiers began to carry themselves with something approaching dignity again. The restoration of basic cleanliness became a foundation for other forms of self-respect. Prisoners began to take better care of their uniforms, to maintain their sleeping areas with greater precision, to interact with each other and even with guards in ways that acknowledged shared humanity, rather than merely the relationship between captor and captive. What made this experience particularly profound was its universality. Unlike food, which varied between camps or work assignments, which depended on local needs, the hygiene routine was remarkably consistent across the American prison system. Whether in camps in Hawaii, California, or the continental United States, Japanese prisoners encountered the same expectation of daily cleanliness, the same provision of soap and hot water, the same systematic attention to human health and dignity. This consistency sent its own message: that American prosperity and organization weren't accidental or temporary, but systematic and reliable. The hot water flowed not because individual guards were kind, but because American society had the resources and the philosophy to make such care standard practice. For prisoners who had experienced the chaos, scarcity, and brutality of Japanese military life, this glimpse of systematic abundance was as shocking as any battlefield defeat. The long-term psychological impact of these daily showers extended far beyond the war itself. When prisoners were eventually repatriated to Japan, many carried with them not just memories of defeat, but evidence of an alternative approach to human organization and social responsibility. They had experienced firsthand a society capable of providing comfort, even to its enemies, resources so abundant that basic human needs could be met without struggle or sacrifice. Some former prisoners found it difficult to readjust to post-war Japanese society, not because they had been broken by captivity, but because they had been exposed to possibilities their homeland couldn't yet provide. They had learned that hot water and soap weren't luxuries but basic requirements of civilized life, that preventing disease was more important than enduring it, that taking care of the body was a form of discipline rather than indulgence. In the decades that followed, as Japan rebuilt itself and eventually surpassed many American living standards, the memory of those prisoner-of-war showers remained vivid in the minds of men who had experienced them. They became a historical footnote with profound implications, evidence that even in warfare, even between bitter enemies, moments of shared humanity could emerge from the most unexpected places. The hot water that once poured from American pipes had carried more than cleanliness. It had carried a lesson about the relationship between civilization and compassion, between strength and care, between winning a war and preserving human dignity. For the Japanese prisoners who experienced it, those daily showers became proof that true power lay not just in the ability to defeat enemies, but in the capacity to treat even defeated enemies as human beings deserving of basic dignity and care. These men learned something that would stay with them forever, that the measure of a civilization isn't found in its weapons or its victories, but in how it treats those who have no power to resist, no ability to reciprocate, and no claim to kindness except their shared humanity. The American showers had taught them that strength and compassion weren't opposites, but partners, and that sometimes the most profound victories are won not on battlefields, but in the simple act of providing hot water and soap to men who had forgotten what it felt like to be clean.